Picture a woman named Rachel. She's just been offered a job in another city. Better pay, a fresh start, a door that opened out of nowhere. And for the first time in a long time, she feels something that might be excitement, or might be God, or might just be a way out of a season that's felt stuck for years. She prays about it, and a thought settles in her chest that feels like direction. Go. But 3 years ago, Rachel felt something just like this before she said yes to a relationship. She was sure, at the time, that God was in it. 8 months later, it ended, and it took her a long time to trust her own sense of direction again. So now she's sitting with her phone in her hand, the job offer waiting for a reply, asking the question underneath all of this: what if I get it wrong again? That's really what this video is about. Not a checklist. Not 5 bullet points to memorize. It's about walking through Rachel's decision step by step, using what the Bible actually gives us, so you can see how this works in a real situation, not just hear about it in theory. If you've ever sat with a decision like Rachel's, you know the loop. Ask God, wait, feel something, then immediately doubt whether that feeling meant anything at all. Maybe you've been told to just follow the peace or trust your gut, and it sounded wise until you actually needed it to work and it didn't tell you anything solid. Maybe like Rachel, you followed a leading before, said yes to something you were sure God was in, and watched it fall apart anyway. Now every new decision comes with a quiet fear attached to it. Not just what should I do, but what if I hear wrong and it costs me something again? That fear is worth naming honestly, because it's the real question underneath this whole topic. Not how does God speak, but what happens to me if I get this wrong? We're going to come back to that question by the end, because Scripture actually has more to say about it than most people realize. Rachel's first instinct is to ask, do I feel peace about this? And she does. It feels calm, even exciting. But here's the problem. Relief can feel exactly like peace. Rachel has been unhappy where she is for 2 years. Of course, leaving feels calm. Almost anything would feel calm compared to staying stuck. That doesn't make it wrong. It just means peace on its own can't tell her what she needs to know. So if peace by itself isn't enough, what actually helps? The Bible gives us more than one thing to work with here. And it's worth being upfront about something important as we go through them. Some of what we're about to cover is Scripture stating something directly. Some of it is wisdom that Christians have reasonably drawn from Scripture over time, applied to situations the Bible doesn't spell out word for word. We'll be clear about which is which, because that distinction matters more than most videos on this topic bother to make. Before we get back to Rachel, it helps to understand why this question feels so unclear to begin with. Look through most of the Bible, and the clearest, most direct instances of God speaking audibly through a prophet, through a dream, tend to be described as significant, often rare moments in a person's life, not a daily occurrence. That doesn't mean God is only distant or silent the rest of the time. Scripture also describes His ongoing presence, His Spirit at work, His care in the details. But the vivid, unmistakable God spoke, and I knew it was Him moments are usually treated in the text as notable events, not the baseline expectation for every decision. Even Samuel, a boy raised inside the temple, sleeping a few feet from the presence of God, heard his name called and didn't recognize whose voice it was. 3 times. That's directly in 1 Samuel chapter 3. It took Eli, an older believer, to help him understand what was happening. So if this feels hard for you, that's not a sign you're missing something everyone else has figured out. Discernment has always been something people had to learn. not something they were simply born knowing. Now, back to Rachel. She doesn't get a dream or a prophet. She gets a thought, a pull, a decision with a deadline. So what does she actually have to work with? The first thing Rachel can check is the one place Scripture speaks with full authority and no ambiguity. Does this decision violate anything the Bible clearly teaches? 1 John chapter 4 tells believers directly to test the spirits, because not everything that feels spiritual is from God. That's not a suggestion, it's a command. For Rachel, this part is actually simple. Taking a new job in a new city doesn't contradict anything Scripture teaches. So this filter clears her decision, but it doesn't finish the job. It only tells her what God has ruled out. It doesn't yet tell her what to do. And that's exactly the problem most of Rachel's real decisions run into. Scripture speaks with full clarity about right and wrong. It's far less specific about which job, which city, which relationship, which timing. So where does she go from there? So Scripture rules nothing out. But it also doesn't tell Rachel which city to live in. That's where most of us get stuck, because from here, the Bible isn't handing us a formula anymore. What it gives us instead is wisdom, the kind of thing Proverbs 3 is talking about when it says to trust God instead of leaning only on your own understanding. Not a mechanism, more like a posture. One part of that wisdom is watching fruit over time. Galatians chapter 5 describes the fruit of the Spirit: love, patience, self-control, and the rest, not as a single feeling in a single moment, but as a pattern that shows up over months and years in a person's life. Applied to Rachel, this raises a fair question, but a careful one. It's not, does option A make me feel more patient than option B, as if fruit were a scoreboard picking the winning choice. Fruit doesn't work that way. It's evidence of what a direction is doing to her character over time, not a signal pointing at the correct answer. So the honest question is broader. Does the pull toward this move tend to grow patience in her, or is it demanding she decide today with no room to think? Does it draw her closer to the people who know her best, or is she suddenly avoiding the conversations that might complicate her excitement? But notice the problem this creates. Fruit takes time to observe, and Rachel has a deadline in a week. She also knows she's not a neutral judge of her own life right now. She wants this to be a yes. So fruit alone can't fully settle it either. She needs eyes besides her own. Proverbs says that in a multitude of counselors there is safety. Not because more opinions automatically equal more truth, but because none of us can fully see our own blind spots. Look at Acts chapter 15. When the early church faced a major decision, the apostles didn't each retreat and act on private impressions. They gathered, weighed Scripture together, listened to testimony, and reached a decision as a body. Rachel realizes she's been doing this whole thing privately, in her own head, which is exactly what got her into trouble 3 years ago. So this time, she does something different. She brings the decision to her pastor and to a close friend who's known her long enough to push back if needed. Her friend asks a hard question. Is this about the job, or is this about running from where you are right now? That question doesn't hand Rachel an answer, but it does something valuable. It exposes a blind spot she couldn't see from inside her own excitement. This is where wise counsel earns its place, not as a rubber stamp, but as a genuine check. Still, after that conversation, Rachel still doesn't have full certainty. So what finally helps her decide? This is where peace comes back in, but differently than where Rachel started. Colossians chapter 3 describes the peace of Christ as something that rules or governs in the hearts of believers. In its original context, That's mainly about peace governing relationships within the church, believers living in unity with one another. Some teachers extend that language to personal decision-making, picturing peace as a kind of umpire making a final call between two options. That's a reasonable application. It's just worth being honest that it's an application, not the direct point the passage is making. Held that way, peace works best once it has something to actually weigh against, after Scripture has ruled nothing out, after fruit has been considered honestly, after wise counsel has spoken into it. At that point, if a lingering unease remains, even after all of that, it's worth paying attention to. And if a settled steadiness remains, even after being challenged by someone she trusts. Rachel almost forgot this piece entirely. She'd been treating the job offer itself as evidence, just because it showed up out of nowhere. It isn't. It's simply one piece sitting alongside everything else she's already weighed. There's a well-known story people bring up here, Gideon and the fleece, from Judges chapter 6. Gideon asked God for a physical sign, twice, before acting on something God had already told him directly to do. That story often gets turned into a method: put out a fleece, ask God for a sign to confirm a decision. But read the actual account, and it looks less like a confident model of discernment and more like a hesitant, doubting request from someone who was afraid. It's a real event in Scripture. It isn't necessarily something Scripture is holding up as the pattern for you to copy. Not everything described in the Bible is something the Bible is telling you to repeat. Now we get to what Rachel's been carrying this entire time. Even after all of this, Scripture, fruit, counsel, peace, circumstance, she still isn't 100% certain. And that scares her, because 3 years ago, with that relationship, she thought she was just as certain. Praying about it wasn't wrong. Hoping wasn't wrong. But it still ended, and it still hurt, and some part of her has been afraid of her own discernment ever since. Here's where Joseph's story matters more than most people realize. Joseph's brothers made a genuinely evil choice. They sold him into slavery. That was never God's will for how they should treat their brother. Years later, Joseph told them, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Read that carefully. Joseph isn't saying their decision was secretly God's plan all along. He's saying God is able to work good through circumstances, including painful ones, including choices that were never His will to begin with. Genesis chapter 50 makes that distinction clear if you sit with it. That changes what getting it wrong actually means. If Rachel's decision 3 years ago turned out badly, that doesn't mean God abandoned the story, or that she's permanently off some perfect track she can never get back onto. It means God is still able to work through what happened next, the same way He did in Joseph's story, and in far worse circumstances than a job that didn't work out. Hebrews chapter 11 is full of people who moved forward in faith, without full clarity about the outcome. Certainty was never the requirement for faithfulness. Trusting God's character, even without a guaranteed result, was. That's the thesis this whole video has been building toward. The goal was never a system that removes all risk. It's growing familiar enough with who God actually is, the way John chapter 10 describes sheep recognizing a shepherd's voice, not because they memorized a formula, but because they know Him, so that walking forward, uncertain but faithful, becomes something you can actually do without being paralyzed by the fear of one more mistake. So how does this play out beyond Rachel's story? If it's a relationship, the same layers apply. Does staying or leaving cross a clear biblical line? What has the pattern of this relationship produced over time, not just in good weeks, but consistently? What do the 2 or 3 people who know you best actually say when you ask them directly? Where does your peace land after that conversation, not before it? If it's a job or a move, weigh it the same way Rachel did. Nothing forbidden, a pattern worth watching, outside perspective that's allowed to disagree with you, and peace as the last piece, not the first. If you're in a waiting season with no clear decision in front of you yet, these same filters still apply to whatever choice does show up. How you spend your time, who you're listening to, what you're preparing for. Waiting isn't the absence of discernment. It's often where the wisdom framework gets practiced in smaller ways. If it's a ministry decision, leading something, stepping back from something, saying yes to a role, the stakes may feel spiritual in a heavier way, but the same layers still hold. James chapter 1 tells believers to simply ask God for wisdom when they lack it, without needing a complicated formula to earn an answer. That applies here as much as anywhere. That's how it plays out for someone like Rachel. She ends up saying yes to the job. But notice what actually changed between the beginning of her story and the end. It's not that she finally became certain. She didn't. She stopped waiting for certainty to show up before she was willing to move. What changed was the process. She checked it against Scripture. She watched the pattern honestly, instead of only trusting her first reaction. She brought it to someone who loved her enough to ask a hard question. She let peace settle after being tested, instead of accepting the first feeling that showed up. That's what she had at the end that she didn't have at the beginning. Not proof, but a decision she could stand behind. And here's the part worth sitting with. Even now, she still doesn't know for certain how this will turn out. It might go well, it might not. This framework was never going to hand her a guarantee, and it isn't going to hand you one either. That's actually the whole point. You may not get a burning bush, you may not get a voice from heaven, but you now have more than a passing feeling to work with. Scripture as the boundary nothing else can override. Character and fruit as evidence over time. Wise counsel as the check on what you can't see in yourself. Peace as what settles after being tested. And circumstances as support, never proof on their own. None of that guarantees you'll get it right. What it gives you is a way to move forward faithfully, even without that guarantee. And if it turns out later that you misread something along the way, that doesn't put you outside of what God can still work through. It never did. Faithfulness was always the actual goal here, not a flawless read on the future. If this gave you a clearer way to think through something you're facing, it might help someone else who's stuck in that same place too. Feel free to share it with them. And if you want more videos that go beyond the surface level answers and actually dig into how faith works in real life, go ahead and subscribe. That's exactly what this channel is here for.